So welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the U.S. Asia Law Institute at NYU School of Law. Today's webinar is about China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. But first, I want to make a few quick announcements. 1 week from today, our next program will feature Yuki Tatsumi, who is Director of the Japan Program at the Stimson Center, who will be talking about revising Japan's security policy for a rapidly changing world. Also, the video recordings from our annual Gillot Dialogue, which we held virtually in a series of panels from March 23rd to March 30th, are now available on our website. The last panel was about the role of corporations in climate change, and the speakers in that panel all contributed papers to an online symposium that we are publishing on our website called The Social Role of Corporations in Asia Pacific. And I just want to mention that we still are rolling out more papers in that series. So far, we have 5 published on the website. Another will be published tomorrow. They are explaining the growing demands that corporations in various Asian jurisdictions are facing from both regulators and investors to address business risks that come from climate change. And we've had papers so far from Japan, Australia, India, and China. And tomorrow's will be about Taiwan. And then we have 2 more coming. So I invite everyone to take a look. They're really quite interesting. So today we are taking a detailed look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been described as one of the most consequential policies directed at the developing world in decades. And it has captured attention from both scholars and policymakers across many fields, obviously economists and development specialists, but also people who study geopolitics and strategy, and those who study culture. It's been one of the factors behind rising Western suspicion and even fear of China. And it's in its starkest terms, the question that gets raised frequently is, what is BRI? Is it an economic development project, or is it a strategy for China to remake the global order in its authoritarian image? So I'm very pleased to have with us an NYU colleague, Maria Adele Carrai, and her research partner, Zhang, who will bring both a fresh perspective on BRI and also share some tools they are developing that organize BRI data. Adele is an assistant professor of global China studies at NYU Shanghai. Her research explores the history of international law in East Asia. She's written a marvelous book about the history of sovereignty in China, called Sovereignty in China, A Genealogy of a Concept Since 1840. Really a great read. And she's currently focused on how China's rise as a global power is shaping norms and redefining the international distribution of power. Zhang is a postdoctoral fellow at the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. She's a fellow at Columbia Harvard China and the World Program. And she researches China's political economy, international development cooperation, foreign aid, and the global expansion of Chinese state-owned enterprises. So our order of proceeding will be first a presentation by Adele and Hong, followed by Q&A. And I'll be looking, as I always do, in the question panel for questions from the audience. Please put your questions there rather than in the chat. And don't wait till the end of the program, put them in, and I always bring them in as we go through the discussion. So Adele, the microphone is yours.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Catherine, for the invitation and the introduction. I'm very excited to be back at NYU Law School. We're colleagues, but in different buildings. NYU is such a big institution, so I'm very excited today to be here. And if Stella wants to start with the PowerPoint, sharing the PowerPoint. So I'm going to present you first briefly the division, the outline of today's presentation, because there's 2 parts of it. So in the first part of the presentation, we're going to talk about perspectives from without, And Hong and I are going to introduce you to two mapping tools to understand the Belt and Road Initiative. One is NYU Shanghai Belt and Road Initiative digital project that I created together with Zhang. And the other one is the People's Map of Global China that Hong has led in the past few years. And I'm going to describe, we're going to present these maps to you. And then in the second part of the presentation, we're going to talk about perspectives from within. So we're going to talk about our work in progress with Hong that tries to deconstruct China developmental state and the Belt and Road Initiative, because often it's thought as an initiative that is led top down from a centralized state. But today we're going to see the role of provinces and how they mobilize to shape and to promote the initiative. Okay, so let's go to the first part of the presentation on the map of I think before. So I want to talk first about mapping, the role of maps, because the tools that we're going to present today are maps about the Belt and Road. So what does mapping do? Maps are instruments of utility that help putting things in place. They're also key to organize our knowledge, to represent our knowledge. And they're symbols and signs that create a system of meaning where these points and lines that are represented in maps inform our discursive and material reality. So how we talk about things, but also inform our material reality. They can have an impact on our concrete daily lives. And another aspect of visualization that is important, especially in international relations, that we can consider ourselves in a post-literate age, where images become our source of information, also in international affairs. And also, before I go into our maps, I want us to think about what does a map do, especially referring to the critical cartography that developed after the 1980s that questioned our understanding of maps as accurate representation of Earth. Maps are social constructs that reflect political and cultural agenda. So this is always something that we want to keep in mind whenever we see a map, also of the Belt and Road Initiative. What does a map do and what it leaves behind? And this you can decide it yourself. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about this digital Belt and Road Initiative digital project of NYU Shanghai. And so first of all, here you see a screenshot that I took of when I Googled BRI images, and you see a plethora of different maps, and it seems almost impossible to talk about the BRI without referring to a map. And I think the reason for this is that it's such a broad initiative, it's a world initiative that we cannot possibly grasp without a visualization of the reach of the BRI. And so the map that I created together with Zhang was motivated by the fact that the existing map, there are many maps, but there is a limitation in terms of quantity of projects that they represent or quality. And in terms of quantity, the issue is also that the BRI per se, it's more of a motto, and there isn't an official list of projects that makes things much more complicated, also to have a comprehensive map with that is more comprehensive. But introducing our two maps, so this NYU Belt and Road Initiative digital project tries to be more comprehensive, as we'll see in a second, and focuses on quantitative, on the quantitative, on the numbers of projects. Hong map, the People's Map of Global China, provides in-depth analysis by scholars and practitioners and aims also to build a global community, and is very qualitative, provide qualitative research. Next slide. And so this is how the map looks like. And so the team, it's Zhang Liang, that is assistant professor, faculty fellow of environmental studies at NYU Shanghai, and myself. And we work in collaboration with NYU Shanghai Center for Global Studies. And the map currently contains 14,399 BRI projects in total. And it will include, for each project, satellite images of before and after 2014 and 2019, and also images of nightlight of before 2014 and after the BRI project was built. Next slide. And so here is like what the data that is included. And our data sources include the Reconnecting Asia Project database, AData GeoQuery, Boston University Global China dataset, and also our own unique dataset of BRI projects that were collected by NYU Shanghai students. And this is on the right is the information that is included in each project. So there is a name, the location, the exact location, the country, type of infrastructure projects, a short description, and these images. Next. And so what really differentiates this data set from all the existing data set is the quantity of data contained. So over 14,000 projects, but also the fact that thanks to Zhang Liang, we were able to collect remote sensing images. And so here, for instance, you see the port city of Colombo in Sri Lanka. You see an image of before the port was built in 2014. And then in 2019, the image of how the port looked like in 2019. And also on the right, we see the nightlight reflecting economic activity of before and after. And so we see that in 2019, there is more nightlight, meaning that there's more economic activity. And next slide, I'm going to show you, you can play, so how the map works. So for instance, if we want to look at Pakistan, where China is building the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So we're zooming in Pakistan near Karachi for a nuclear power plant that was built as part of the BRI. And so here we have a cluster of 9 projects. We zoom in again, and we click on one of the projects. So here. And so we see this Karachi nuclear power complex that was funded by Exim Bank, was built in 2014. And then we can see the images of before and after the power plant was completed, and also the nightlight that shows the economic activity. So that's all from me and this BRI digital project at NYU Shanghai. And Zhang Liang and I hope that this will become a useful tool for scholar practitioners that are interested in better understanding China BRI and like the scope of it. And now I leave the floor to Hong, that will talk about her map. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Adele. So I'm going to introduce our project that's called People's Map of Global China. As you can see, and also it's already online with the URL is the peoplesmap.net. So the reason why we created this project was that we feel that there's a lot of study, a lot of information about global China, China's global engagements everywhere in Africa, in Asia, Latin America. But usually such information is quite fragmented, usually siloed by disciplinary boundaries or by regional focus. And we feel that in order to understand the concept of global China, the impacts of China's global impacts, we really need to integrate all this information to have, this kind of a place that where people can come together and really share information and to be able to have more informed discussion. So this was our original motivation. And then the other part is that we feel that there's also this strategic value of bringing together the academia as well as civil society organizations, because we know there are many, many civil society organizations that have been following Chinese overseas activities. They have been trying to engage with Chinese actors, and they have much more granular information or knowledge about specific Chinese projects or the impacts on the local communities. And while on the other hand, the academia probably we study, the macro chains, we study the history, the context, the political economy, geopolitics. And we have this big picture. So I think we think it would be very good for if both communities can come together and share information and help each other in each of our own pursuits. So this project was initially conceived by Professor Qingquan Li of UCLA. Together with Ivan Franceschini, who is a postdoctoral fellow currently at Australian National University. And so back in 2019 and 20, we started to discuss about doing something like this. And so this, the initial people involved, including Professor C.K. Lee, Ivan, and myself, Mark Ball, who is our colleague from the civil society organization called Inclusive Development International, and also Nicholas Lubert, who's with the Lund University. And so the five of us, basically, we started this project, but currently our editorial board has expanded. We are bringing more editors, more academics, and practitioners from elsewhere to cover different regions. And so this website was launched in April last year. As you can see, as Adele mentioned, our focus, our goal is primarily with a qualitative analysis, qualitative information of China's overseas projects. So the way we do is that we really provide very in-depth information about each project, and we invite our contributors who are either academics or civil society organization who have really studied these projects in depth to write about them, to create all this the archive and the documentation of the projects. That's our main content. So far in the past year, as you can see, we have created contents for 35 countries and 46 projects. As you can see shown on the map, which is not many, but still it's ongoing project. We are continuing to receive contributions from our partners and contributors, and so this will be still ongoing. We are going to, so please watch this space. So just a bit more about our contents. So as I said, basically we have two types of contents, and the country profile and the project profile. So in the country profile, these are the main sections that we cover these different aspects. We try to use this country profile really to provide an overview of China's bilateral relations with the specific countries, just to provide a background for people to understand what's going on and why China is engaging in this country and what China is doing there. So basically the country profile would cover the historical background of the relationship and the BRI status, whether the country has signed any BRI agreements with China and what kinds of projects and initiatives are undergoing. And also some basic information about the economic relations between the two countries, including their trade, investment, aid, and other finance. And also, I think very interestingly and very importantly, what are the controversies and challenges that are facing the bilateral relations? What are the things that have been most controversial and about China's engagement in that country? Oh, sorry. And in the project profiles, also we have the basic information about the project, their cost, their location, their companies involved, their status, and what sectors they are in. So this basic information there. And then the most importantly are the project outlines and project impacts. So these are the contents that have been created by people who really do study them in depth. So we provide the narrative of how this project evolved from the very beginning. Who are the actors that have been involved? What are the issues that have been encountered? And then also we very much focus on providing to talk about documents the impacts of these projects, the social and environmental impacts. So what have been the reaction from the local community, and what are some of the things that have been done to help address some of the concerns. So these are also covered in the project profiles. And in both country profile and project profiles, we try to create, we have both this sources section. These are basically bibliography or important publications or information resources that can be used for any person who wants to learn more about these projects in depth, who want to do their own research. So, and also when I talk about projects, we also try to be we don't try to impose any narrow definition of the project. We just want to include any project that might be developed, financed, or even contracted to Chinese entities. And they are also not confined to projects that happened after 2013 when the BRI was launched. And so, as I said, our profiles were written by researchers with grounded knowledge of local conditions, very in-depth information. And all these profiles are reviewed by our editors and sometimes reviewed by other experts. So we try to really ensure the accuracy and also fact check everything. And also these profiles are updated as needed, because many of the projects still ongoing, still developing, and new things could happen. So our editorial board, and we try to update these profiles when these major events happen. And so just a quick look at the project database, because we also have this interface of just all the projects that we have, all the project profiles that we have. And we have this filter function where people can choose to just look at the projects that they are more interested in. For example, if they want to look at projects in the logistics sector, and they can choose from this from the filter here, of if they want to focus on projects that are financed by China SM Bank, they could also choose from here. So this is just some function that we have that could be used to select the projects. So now back to Adele.
Thank you, Hong. And so now we're moving to the second part. We will try to keep the presentation within time. And so I will be quick, and I hope also Hong will be quick so that we have time for questions. And I saw there was already a lot of very interesting questions in the Q&A. And so in the second part, we want to introduce more our current work in progress. And Hong and I are very interested in understanding the role of provinces, Chinese provinces, in shaping the BRI. Very often when we hear about BRI and China going out, this China threat and so forth, we think of it in terms of this massive monolith that has direct control over its own economic actors abroad, not to mention internally. And the same, again, is thought for the BRI. BRI is seen as this initiative led by this central state with no issue, right? It's because it's authoritarian, so everything is chosen and is implemented, is decided from the center and then implemented. However, we should sort of domesticate also the BRI and try to understand the very important role that provinces have in shaping the BRI, China, domestic and also foreign policies. And so and now we're going to talk a bit about like the vision, how the central state envisioned the role of provinces in the BRI, and how they mobilitate to embrace or challenge sometimes the initiative. And it's interesting to see how within China there is a competition between provinces for their niche positions in China's national and international economy. That is based on this consensus that internationalization is key for the growth and development of China, and also for the provinces or municipalities' interest. And now again, I leave the floor to Hong that will elaborate more on the role of provinces.
Yes, so thank you, Adele. So the previous part, we talked about BRI projects, overseas projects globally. That's usually the view people understand BRI. But in China, I think BRI is understood a little bit differently. By the domestic actors in China, BRI has been understood as one of a number of centrally driven trans-provincial development strategies to reshape China's regional economic geography. So here are some of the other so-called national development strategies that have been mentioned in parallel with BRI. And I just want to introduce them to you so that people could have an idea. So some of these national strategies include the Yangtze River Economic Belt, as you can see. This is the Yangtze River that's really stretched across central China and several different provinces. And the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei synergy development. So that's Beijing, Tianjin are the two major cities in North China, and also Hebei province that's surrounding the two cities. And the Yangtze River Delta integration. So very importantly, Shanghai and the nearby provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangsu. This is also a very economic heavyweight region in China. And also in southern China, the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area, that's another region, of course, as you can see, is where it's the economic powerhouse of China. And there's also the Yellow River, so-called Yellow River Basin ecological protection and high quality development. That's also again a stretch across different provinces along the Yellow River. So as you can see, these national development strategies that released across different provinces are a very important feature of Xi Jinping's administration's economic development strategies, really trying to break across the boundaries of provincial governments, because as people who study Chinese economy probably know, that China has this almost de facto federalism, or where the provincial governments really are key in implementing a lot of economic policies, and so at the same time, the provincial governments can be very powerful in terms of protecting their own local economies. So that create these boundaries between provinces. So it's sometimes created too much competition or protectionism within the provinces. And that's why the national government always has this interest to bring these different provinces together and toward a more national economy. So this is a national integration motive behind the BRI. And the BRI, as I said, mentioned together with all these national strategies, rather the goal is to further integrate these regional economies into the international economy. So this is the context and background of BRI understood domestically. And as this map just shows what's mentioned in the 2015 Vision and Action documents, which is a very important document for BRI, basically just laid out the central state's vision for BRI. And as you can see from this map, the central government basically divide China into 4 large different regions, and each region is supposed to target their international economy in different ways. For example, the northeastern part would target Russia, and then here Inner Mongolia, of course, Mongolia, and then the western regions would target Central Asia, West Asia, and the eastern coast would target the Southeast Asia and along the Pacific. So this is just the overview vision, the central state's top-down vision. And then we are going to talk about the mobilization of our provinces. How do the provinces, since we mentioned that they are very important actors, players in implementing policies, how are they being mobilized? So the way we try to study this is we try to collect policy documents issued by provincial governments that are related to BRI. So far we have been able to collect over 200 policy documents from various levels of provincial governments, sometimes municipal governments as well, between 2013 and 21. And we are still, this probably is not complete, so we're still going to collect more. As we can see from what we collected so far already, there are at least 18 provinces out of the 31 provincial units in mainland China that have developed their own BRI specific strategies and policies that really shows how they are trying to translate this top-down vision into their local initiatives based on their local conditions. So we are able to see that a lot of strategic positioning of different provinces, the way they try to see what kind of position they could take in the overall picture of BRI, so that they could have some kind of advantage and a distinguishing feature. So for example, the province of Jiangsu, that's in East China on the coast, it envisions itself as a convergence point of the Belt and the Road, because Jiangsu has this advantage of being at the endpoint of the Trans-Eurasian Railway. At the same time, it has its ports and other things. So it imagines itself to be this point where the land-based economic belt, the Silk Road economic belt, and the maritime-based economic road, the Silk Road, could come together, and they could, try to integrate the two parts of the economy together. And another example, Chongqing is a major city in Western China, also imagine itself to be the inland high ground for opening up, because as we know that the inland part of China has been traditionally less integrated into the global economy. So some of these cities in Western China, they are trying to come up with new initiatives to be able to develop their own international economy. And we are seeing also very interestingly new instruments that have been developed by these subnational governments. For example, Zhengzhou is another city in central China in Henan province. It has been trying to create this Zhengzhou Luxembourg Air Silk Road. So they are going to create not just a logistic connection between this city and Luxembourg in Europe, and create around the airlines and everything. They are going to create aviation centers, the new tourism and technology center. So a lot of new ideas around this idea of being more connected to other parts of the world. Another interesting example would be Ningbo in Zhejiang province, also in East China. They are going to develop a series of China-Italy cooperation zones that really cover a wide range of sectors, the creative industry, technology, infrastructure. So the Ningbo has been specifically targeting Italy as its partner in really enhance their economic ties, their economic connections. So I guess, and then apart from these BRI specific policy initiatives, we are also seeing that the provinces have been trying to renew their existing policy initiatives in terms of their development of global economy, international economy, and trying to piggybacking on the BRI, because BRI is such a big thing in China, and everyone wants to show that they are doing something to contribute to BRI. But at the same time, they also realize that the BRI is such a strategic opportunity for all the regional economies, because they could make use of the central government's policy support, financial support, and everything, and try to really give a push to their own already existing policy initiatives. So various provinces, again, have their own industrial policies to promote their own industries. For example, Zhejiang, again, the eastern province, has specific strategies to promote its e-commerce, and there are even Chinese medicine, their fishing industry and shipping industry and so on. So we are seeing a lot of activities happening that are in the name of the BRI, of course. But also, interestingly, I want to mention that when we see these policy documents issued by the provincial governments, we do realize that the most active provinces are not necessarily the ones that are envisioned to play the most important roles by the central government, as I showed in the previous slide, the top-down vision. So that shows the examples will be Jiangsu and Zhejiang province were not that important in the central government's vision, but they have turned out to be very active and had a lot of very creative policy initiatives. Whereas Fujian and Xinjiang, two provinces that were envisioned to be the core zones of the maritime and land-based economic, the Silk Road, respectively, they have not been that active. So that just shows that local agency really matters in shaping what the BRI would look like. So just trying to wrap up, the BRI, as I would try to argue, that is China's developmental statecraft. We know that all these policy initiatives are quite decentralized and fragmented, as many other scholars have also argued. But in a way, they are also orchestrated. This is the term used by the political scientist James Riley to describe China's economic statecraft. They are still based on a top-down, a very centralized vision of what are the ways forward, what are the overall strategy, and also, as we have tried to say, that we try to emphasize the importance of mapping. This is based, all these strategies are based on the conceptualization of the economic geography. So you really need to know the geography that's behind all these thinking to be able to understand what BRI is about. And BRI, in a way, just urges the provincial governments to reimagine their positions in the domestic regional, as well as international economies. And also it's a renewed push for internationalization of the regional economies. And again, the actual implementation of BRI will critically depend on the policy entrepreneurs of the local governments, because it is the provincial and lower level governments that come up with the concrete policy initiatives to make things happen. So these are the key mediators between the central state and the economic actors, the business. And so, and again, I think this confirms with the concept of local state corporatism that has been developed, a concept that has been developed by Jean Oy in the 1990s to describe the very important critical roles of the local state. And I think that's still a very valid, a very important insight for today. So with that, I'll conclude this presentation and we will welcome any questions from you.
Okay, thank you so much, Huang and Adele. That was really fabulous. And Adele, I want to check, is your map live yet? Is it available for people to look at?
Yes, but the satellite images are not there yet. We have two separate websites, so we're trying to merge. So it's not in a finalized state yet. We hope to finalize it in the next month or so, but it's still online. It's already available online. Yeah.
So could each of you maybe put the URLs for the maps into the chat, and then people can have a look up close. I've been looking at them myself the last few days off and on, and they really are quite, they draw you in, because you start asking, what about this? And I heard about that. And there's quite a bit of information there to unpack. So I think people will enjoy that. And somebody has asked this also in the Q&A, and it's a question that I was thinking as I listened to you. Is there anything comparable being developed or on offer already from any institution or government or academic or otherwise in China? In other words, is there a Chinese analog of this kind of work? Because I know that there's no official list of, here are all the projects we call BRI projects. There's nothing like that. But is anybody in any of the government agencies produced any kind of a database, whether using the form of a map or some other form that people can use to study? Or is this only being done outside?
Adele, you want to go, or I can?
Yeah, not to my knowledge. So the only, like, there is one official website for the BRI that has like some of the projects, but I think from the government, there's no official map of the BRI yet. And I'm not aware of scholars that are doing, I mean, there are maps existing, kind of non-interactive map in China, like in a lot of Chinese sources, but I don't know of any interactive map like the one of Hong or NYU Shanghai.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah, I
have
agree.
any theories as why that would be? Because as one of you mentioned, your map projects aren't the only ones even that are being created outside China by different groupings of scholars and so on. I've seen one that focuses on the digital BRI or digital Silk Road, and at least one other. So there's a number of them out there. And as you've pointed out, it seems like an intuitive kind of a tool, because it's so far flung that you want to, how else do you kind of get your arms around all of that information? Do you have any theories as to why this is something that's only being done abroad?
I can say, and then I leave to Hong. I think it's partly related to the fact that there is no willingness for now from the central government to even add a list, because there isn't even a list of official list of BRI projects, and I think also it is intimidating once you look at the map, like over 14,000, and is not comprehensive. These are all China finance projects, BRI or not BRI. I mean, it is like, to visualize it that way, I think it's kind of it can be a bit scary if you don't understand exactly the nature, to understand really the extent. So if I were the Chinese government, I would not have much interest probably in showing the reach of the global influence of China and in all the countries, because then you also become accountable on the other side of things. But maybe Hong has also other insights.
Yeah, I think that's also why we try to present this view from inside, because I think from the Chinese point of view, they look at BRI, they think about policy initiatives, programs, the initiative to create linkages between various parts of China and the rest of the world. They think about it less in terms of projects. That's the way usually outside observers try to imagine BRI as, concrete projects, individual projects. So that's why I think to the Chinese policymakers, it's much less a priority to try to visualize all the projects on the map. And also at the same time, because we've been saying that, a lot of these projects are initiated by subnational governments. And each, as far as I know, these governments, subnational governments do have their list of projects, their priority list, but the list is evolving all the time. So they would graduate some projects once they have been implemented, and they will add new projects into. So these lists are rolling. So it's just quite impossible to be able to provide an up-to-date database of all projects of all provinces.
One of the audience questions asks, does the government of China consider this mapping a threat?
I hope not. I don't think so. But I would imagine there might be controversies in terms of which projects are considered BRI. Because we do see there's a lot of bandwagoning by private businesses who try to frame or brand their projects as BRI. And some of the business initiatives some of them were even illicit activities, as we have seen in Southeast Asia. Like some business, they try to create basically a gambling zone in some neighboring countries in China. And they try to frame it as a BRI project. Because it's on the border of China, Myanmar, and Thailand. And then in that specific case, the Chinese embassy in Myanmar came out to categorically reject that it was a BRI project. So you see there's a lot of these controversies going on. So I imagine there might be some push back. If we do present this to Chinese policymakers, they might say that we don't know if this is a BRI. So I think the way we as external researchers try to analyze BRI, we try to have some kind of definition. Sometimes such definition can be a little bit imposed because we just need to have a way to make sense of things. But that is not necessarily the way the Chinese policymakers are looking at these things. Adele.
Right.
Yeah, no, I agree, and actually can also be helpful for the Chinese government. I think it's, rather than being a threatening tool, I think it can be a supporting tool for the Chinese government. That, like, you know, it doesn't do it itself, but it's out there, and I think it can also better understand the, you know, the reach and the complexity of this initiative. Yeah.
Well, one thing struck me looking at the maps is that you can only show actual physical projects in a sense. So if it's a dam, if it's a railroad or something, that is a dot on a map. But Hong, I was reading something that you wrote recently where you were emphasizing the 6 pillars, so-called 6 pillars or aspects of the BRI, and a number of them are not about physical infrastructure or any physicality. They're about you know, people-to-people exchanges, finance and trade relations. I think you were pointing out that customs agreements and standard setting initiatives between China and other countries has also been folded into BRI, which I thought was very interesting. I had no idea that that was also now being brought into the soup pot, you know, and so those things, there's no, you can't put a pin in a map. You can't, so do you, how do you address them, or do you not, are you not able to address these in the maps? And then, you know, sort of following from that question, does that mean then that the maps themselves understate the scope and the ambition of BRI? If BRI is, in a sense, almost every foreign initiative of the government, you know, trade agreements with other countries and standard setting initiatives at international organizations, if all of that is also BRI, then is BRI really even bigger than you're showing or than we imagine?
Yeah, I do agree. That's also one of the things I've been trying to argue. You know, we can't just think of BRI as specific infrastructure projects, because there's so much more, like what you already mentioned. You know, a lot of the BRI activities, activities that have been folded under BRI has been about, you know, the customs agreements, and also, you know, just not just from the central government, but also from different regional governments. They try to have agreements with other countries in terms of to facilitate trade in different forms. You know, there's all kinds of streamlining the administrative process to really facilitate trade activities and this kind of things, and also like a taxation agreements, and also like setting up some kind of representative office of a province in some other countries, this kind of thing. And so indeed, it's quite impossible to map out, visualize all these activities in this way. So I think our maps just provide one dimension, one of the aspects of the BRI, and a very important dimension. But we just need to keep in mind the BRI is such a broad campaign. I would use the word campaign to really push for a lot of activities to happen. And that's why Adele and I, we are trying to just look at the provincial level, you know, what are being done on the ground, what are the more concrete policy actions that have been taking place to complement this view of the project-based understanding of BRI.
If I can say, I think that the points in a map are dead. And so they're just points. And so one thing that is missing in both maps is connectivity as well. That could be probably represented in some ways, but also everything that surrounds these points, the fact that there is an infrastructure built, what are the consequences, like from a normative point of view, or even a social economic, environmental. And that's why these, again, as Stella was saying, these are just tools, one among many tools that shows just one facet of BRI. And that's also the reason why both websites also promote research. So we complement these static points with research that tells more of what happened from the ground, right, on the BRI. And that would be an integral part of both websites. Also, the digital initiative, the BRI digital initiative at NYU Shanghai, we plan to complement this map with research that tell us more about, again, environmental, social impact of the initiative, even normative impact of the initiative. But again, I think it's still good to visualize. We have to start from somewhere. And I think there is still a value in this map, in seeing the scope of the BRI.
I want to point out that in the Q&A panel, Dr. Nora Sosmakat in Germany at the Urgewald NGO called Urgewald says a bit of advertisement. We have something similar for AIIB projects and a link. And I'm going to try to copy that into the chat panel now so that everyone can see that as well. So that's another one. If anybody else in the audience has maps you want to draw to our attention, we can also share those links as well, because I think they are all focusing on something a little bit different, and therefore they're complementary. One question, well, there are a lot of questions about the provincial role here, because I think that hasn't been mentioned specifically. So maybe we'll just draw on that a little bit. Do we see the BRI initiative generating or sort of like incentivizing provinces to reach out more than they would have otherwise? Or do you think they're really just kind of putting a BRI hat on things that they already wanted to do? So is it causing them to, for example, enter into new cooperative agreements with foreign cities, foreign provinces, whether they're trade agreements or other kinds of agreements? Do you see those kinds of agreements happening that you can say, oh yes, this is definitely because of BRI? Or do you look at it and say, well, it's hard to tell?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's also the question I've been trying to ask myself as I try to went through the policy documents issued by provincial governments. I think it's a little bit hard to distinguish the two, even though let me just try to give some examples. I think Ningxia province is in northwestern China. It's a province with a lot of Muslim population, and their role in the BRI, in the Silk Road economic belt, has been to build connections with the Arab countries. And of course, this has been building on their existing cultural linkages with the Arab region. And that's why it has been tasked to really try to create more economic linkages by hosting some kind of expo, and by hosting a lot of events to try to create the exchange of economic activities between this Ningxia province and Middle East. So can we say this would only happen because of a BRI, or it would happen anyway? I think it's not easy to give a cut-off answer, but I would imagine that if without the BRI, we might not see this intensity of activities that are taking place in Ningxia, just trying to tap into, trying to take advantage of this cultural linkage they have already had, which was quite thin, I would say. But now they are trying to think about all kinds of ways to really be able to do more things with the Arab region. So I think that's a very good example that I would give as what has really happened only because of BRI.
Mm-hmm. Is there, have you looked, or maybe you haven't gotten to this yet, have you looked at provincial GDP data, trade data, that kind of thing, other kinds of metrics to sort of see a before and after picture for them? Would that possibly help shed light?
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. But I haven't got to that. Yeah, but that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Okay. Adele, did you have something to add to that?
I think Hong already answered, rather quite comprehensive answer already. So.
Look, to what extent do you think that this dynamic that you've described, the de facto kind of federalism, you know, of a top-down initiative that is the vision of the central government, that the provinces to some extent are told, you know, they should be a part of, and they're even to some extent, as you've mentioned, I think, Hong, they're assigned roles, like, you know, this is your role, this is, you know, because of your geographic location or the context you have, you've been given a role. That top-down element, and then the provinces imagining themselves, that dynamic, to what extent is it unique to BRI, or to what extent do you think this is just a very good illustration of something that you can see across all of Chinese governance in all areas?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the latter. It's just the way the Chinese political economy has been operating. But the BRI just, you know, get all this attention for us to really look at how this is done on a global scale. And indeed, and perhaps in the BRI, that was a bit more unique is that it does involve a lot of diplomacy from the central government to be able to go to all the countries and sign the strategic agreements, be MOUs with other governments, and that creates provides the condition for a lot of follow-up activities to happen. So in that sense, you do have this more top-down, the top-down element is perhaps more visible, but still a lot of activities on the ground still could happen when the provincial government and municipal governments are able to do something. And so that's why the capacity of the local governments and the entrepreneurship of their officials are really important in this process. And Adele.
Yeah, and also I think the interpretation, right? It's very interesting to see the interpretation that the provinces do of the central government policies, because it's not just them implementing, but also how they understand it. And I'm sure the understanding is partly different from the provinces to the central government. And so this, I think, should also be kept in mind, right? When and this translation and interpretation, so transplantation of a central government policy to the provincial level. Yeah.
So, and a couple of the audience questions circle around this theme. So let me just throw them all out together as a group. So one is, has the provincial BRI activity created conflict with central government planning? And then another one asks, regarding the understanding of the role of provinces, the local provinces are playing an important role in shaping what BRI looks like. Thus, when the reshaping result is different from expectations of the central state, how can we understand the BRI goals? So to some extent, there's some overlap there. You know, is there tension? Is there conflict between what the provinces are coming up with and what the center is doing? How does the center guide and not control, but guide the provinces so that they're all kind of moving in the general direction that they want?
We need to go first.
Yeah.
So these are, again, very good questions that also make us, that we have been also wondering about this too. I don't see that much conflict, even though I also mentioned in the slide that some of the provinces turn out to play more important role than was envisioned by the central government. For example, Jiangsu province, of course, people probably know this, a very big economy on the east coast of China. It was not in the original vision and action document issued by the central government in 2015. So that document didn't give didn't mention even that the province in terms of what the provinces are supposed to do. But then afterwards, as we already see that it has a lot, the province has come up with a lot of initiatives and trying to really, so they would use such terms as integrating themselves into the BRI strategy. So I think from the central government point of view, they probably would be quite happy about it, because even though the way I look at this initial 2015 vision action document was that it was just something to work with, something to start with, and it's not like set in stone. Even though the central government does have some of its considerations in terms of which countries China wants to enhance the diplomatic relations with, and so that's some of the central government perspective. But the ultimate goal is really just to encourage all the regional governments to build this relationship with other parts of the world, to create economic activities, boost development and growth. So the central doesn't really mind that Jiangsu turns out to be much more active in reaching out to other parts of the world. So in that sense, I think it's less of a conflict. But are there tension? Are there conflict? Are there cases where provinces do something that really contradicts or that create troubles for other actors? There might be. We just don't know yet. So far, we haven't been able to find. But I would not be surprised if that happens. Adele.
Yeah, I think that like looking at Chinese economic actors abroad, like when they do bad things, so I think probably will be similar to provinces, that there will be, that the central government, a representative from the central government go and put back things into the right track according to the central government. So I'm sure like if they go off the track, too much off the track, in the negative sense, if they go in the positive sense, do whatever you want, you're overly active, great. But I think if they go off track, then the central government will probably kind of scold it, like put things back on track, and maybe fire someone, or like send someone to a remote place. I don't know. Yeah,
there'll be consequences.
Yes.
One of you mentioned in passing, and it caught my ear, that some provinces have now set up offices in Belt and Road countries, host countries. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Is that, because that would be a kind of a indicator, I guess, of concrete provincial activity, something measurable. How many do you see?
I've seen some examples, like Ningbo, again, a city in Zhejiang province. They are targeting Central Eastern Europe, and so they have set up representative offices in the region, I guess. But I think this might not be entirely new. Like something that we didn't realize before was, all these provincial governments, they are super active. They are like businessmen trying to promote their provinces. So they would go a great lengths to set up offices in other parts of China as well as outside of China, to have their officials trying to sell their province to international businesses. So these things have been going on, but maybe just they are becoming more focused and more targeted, and when they think about how they can better integrate into the overall BRI vision.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe they label themselves as BRI. So that's the difference, right? It's also a lot of projects that existed before BRI was launched. Like the same is true. It's not that like the BRI was launched and then all of a sudden all this new project from zero started, but they were already before existing infrastructure investments all over the world from China. But then there is this new vision, right, that comes into place. And so you want to label whatever you're doing as a business person as part of the BRI, hoping to get maybe more funds and more support. Yeah.
So this leads to the obvious question, and somebody has asked it. So how do you decide what you're going to count as a BRI project and include in your map?
Yeah. So in our, like in the 14,000 project that we still have to verify, we have to find ways to better verify, make sure that these are being labeled in some ways as BRI projects. But it is kind of still an issue that it comes back, like what is a BRI, what is a BRI project? And I think for us it's more like if it's financed by a major China policy bank and it has been discussed either by the host country or the China central government as a BRI, then this become BRI. But it can be contested as also Hong was saying, or I think Catherine was saying before, I forgot who of you was saying before, like initially that the local embassy said this is not BRI, we refuse when the project on the border. But it's, and it is a bit contested potentially. So because there isn't official list yet.
Yeah, and for our map, the people's map of global China, we avoid the label of BRI project. It's just China's overseas activities. So we understand that we don't, and it's not necessary for us to really try to have this label BRI or no, because we are mostly interested in global China's global engagements. We don't really need to confine to whether it's BRI or not. So that's important for us. But I understand that like some other projects, other efforts to map out BRI activities need to have some way to be able to say some things, what are BRI. And I think as long as there's a clear definition that's consistently applied, and that's okay. It doesn't, it's not the official BRI, but it's one way of looking at BRI. That's okay.
Also, I mean, one of the goals of BRI is to be like a common initiative. So it should be also reinterpreted by others in a way. Although I don't think the central government would like that, but host countries could say this is part of the BRI. If this is truly a global initiative that is not only China-centered, then I also can do my own BRI. I mean, this is a very challenging, very provocative way of thinking about BRI. But I think a Hong way of like not just limiting to just BRI, but just looking at global China and its global engagement is a good way to go. Yeah.
Right. This maybe is a prompt or a reminder for us to sort of update our mental approach, our benchmarking for BRI. It means from when this was first rolled out in the very early years, 2014, 2015, 2016, it did look more like a contained project or, an initiative, of course, is the official word they use, but something you could put in a box or put some lines around and say, this is it, it's either in or it's out, and since then, though, in more recent years, it has definitely busted out of any kind of constraints. And the image that I'm getting from hearing you speak and from looking at your maps and some of the articles you've both written is that BRI, we shouldn't think of it as a project or a set of projects directed by a single office that has perhaps a budget, and a list and a set of definitions. We should think of it completely differently as a vision, as a kind of a spirit of China engaging in the world, or what China sees its role being, or the ways in which China wants to present itself, and a narrative, in effect, a grand narrative that accompanies and motivates China's foreign engagement across the board. And therefore, it's less limited. It's become over time less and less limited to this set of countries or that set of countries. And so to some extent, I actually started to wonder when I was reading your work, is BRI really just another word for China's foreign engagement or China's foreign policy? the way in which China is going to achieve the goal that Xi Jinping has articulated of a common destiny, a shared destiny for all of mankind? Is BRI really just sort of like the physical embodiment of that goal?
Yeah, I agree. This is a perfect way of putting it. And even though initially there might be a more defined scope of BRI, on the Eurasian continent and the maritime Silk Road, initially that was the vision. It has a more clear geographic scope. But as we all know, it has really exploded to include any kind of China's international economic engagement. So in that sense, yes, BRI is just increasingly shapeless. But I think I would still want to say that the impetus behind the BRI, even though Xi Jinping has been using such terms as the global, the commons, prosperity, things like that, the initial impetus was still trying to secure China geopolitically and geoeconomically. And so there is some kind of idea or rationale behind which countries China wants to build more economic ties with. So that impetus is still there, but how much that would shape things happening on the ground, as we try to argue, all these provinces come in and do their own things. Maybe that's less important in terms of affecting how things happen on the ground. So I think increasingly we would have to separate the geopolitical analysis of BRI with the economic analysis of a BRI.
Yeah, I agree with this BRI as a grand vision and as a kind of a facilitator of China foreign policy. I don't think it corresponds necessarily to China foreign policy. It's an element that supports it. But yeah, it became like so broad, so expansive that, yeah.
So a very particular question about the map or the maps. Do they include projects that have been paused or delayed or canceled?
Yeah, in mine, yes. And so again, one of the problem of having like this large quantity of data is to verify, but we plan to also include projects that have been suspended. So there will be also points of projects that have been suspended and with a short description. And you will see before and after through satellite images whether anything has happened. Yeah, and that's why it needs to be updated. It needs a lot of manpower to updating all this data.
Yeah, in our map too, we also try to include projects that have been canceled or suspended. If these projects were significant, for example, in Myanmar, the Misong Dam project that was canceled 10 years ago, but it was a very significant event in the relationship between China and Myanmar. And so we try to include projects like this too. So because they also provide important insight.
Right. So this is really something that's going to require an ongoing long-term commitment, either from the groups of scholars who are behind each map, or also some kind of a means of handing the project off. At a certain point, you're going to want to move on to the next phase of your research careers, and you'll have to hand this off to somebody to carry it on. There are a number of questions about specific projects and why they're in or whether they're out. And I guess we probably don't want to get caught up in discussions of individuals, but one person does point out that they see a project that is funded by another funder, not a Chinese funder, in this case, JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And so this does lead to a question of whether BRI projects are co-funded by non-Chinese funding sources, whether public or private, host country or international. How often do we actually see that? I mean, I haven't actually seen any discussion about co-funding by other international organizations of BRI projects, but how much is that actually happening?
it is happening. I don't know the exact percentage. I don't know the exact percent, but when I did some work in Africa, and I'm sure there are also other data set, ADATA, the China Africa initiative at Johns Hopkins. I think they have also probably more of a sense of what's happening and cooperation, but it definitely exists. Cooperation on the ground, and also I talk mostly about China policy banks, but Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is also part of that. So that's not just China; that's a multilateral financial institutions that contribute also to some very few BRI projects, but is also there.
For our map, we include all kinds of projects that are not just financed by Chinese entities, that we include projects that are contracted to Chinese companies to build, but they might have been financed by other people. So we will include all kinds of projects. But when it comes to BRI, the question of, like we have been saying, like our discussion has really emphasized that BRI is just not a China funded, it's not a list of projects that had a budget line or something. It's an initiative, a campaign to make things happen.
Vision. Right. I really like the vision that's been suggested.
As you know, and the Chinese government in recent years, they have also been very consciously bringing other partners, trying to use this so-called third market mechanism to create or encourage Chinese companies and banks to work with other international banks and companies to co-produce the projects, co-construct, co-finance. And that has been the goal of the Chinese government too, because they realize, one, they don't have enough money for all these things, of course. Right. Two, they need experience of international banks in terms of risk control or other companies in terms of managing, operating the projects, the ports, the various infrastructure projects. They need, this different kind of expertise that the Chinese companies may not have. So this is the push for this kind of collaboration. But of course, whether that would happen would depend a lot on international politics, whether other countries will be willing to work with China and join in these efforts.
Right. To what extent do your maps show the details of financing? The sources of financing, percentages of ownership, if known, and also debt. One of the questions from the audience asks about the proportion of the projects that have debt that is in default or not being serviced. Obviously, the debt angle is something that has been very front and center in a lot of the international discussions of the project, accusations that China's sort of using it to create a debt trap for developing countries. But do your maps try to capture any of that data so that we can try to see to what extent this is happening and who actually does have ownership of these?
Yeah, in our map, we do. We pay a lot of attention to these details. That's why we need this in-depth narrative to provide information. And in all these projects, as long as there's information available, we ask the author to write about who are the financiers, if the percentages are available. And also, there are also the cases where, the financiers and owners changed over time. So we'll also have that background information. So we do try to provide such information where there is important and necessary. And for example, we have a project profile for Hanban Port, which of course is the focus of all these debt trap. So we have very detailed information about the financing and the debt issue, all these controversies, and also research has been done about how the debt issue. So the information is all there.
Not for us. So we just present the year, the cost, how it costed the project if we fund it. the currency, and then who's the funder. So what, maybe China policy banks or others, but we don't go into details regard to debt, who owns the debt. We also, the borrower also, we try to also identify the borrower. But again, the research, we hope that then a team of researchers will do that. Will write maybe articles about that. That requires very sophisticated knowledge, like going into all this documents that, and also a big problem is that they're not available to the public. So there is really a lack of transparency. So it's very hard to really have a real sense of the amount of this debt. And again, Carrai, where also Hong is a fellow right now.
Yeah,
that's great.
I need to do a plug-in for Carrai too. Professor Deborah Brautigam.
Yeah.
She has been in the team of my colleagues there.
Carrai stands for the China-Africa
Research Initiative. John Hopkins University. They've done incredible job, like they're very much on the top of things, because there's so much misinformation. Like we hear over and over, debt trap here and there, but very often these articles are produced with based on one piece of paper in agreements that are thousands of pages, and most of them are not even available to the public. And so I think if people want to have a better understanding of debt, what countries owe to China for African countries, Carrai is a wonderful resource.
Yeah, one upcoming paper that Professor Brautigam will be published very soon, next week, will be a case study of the Kenya standard gauge railway, because there has been, accusations that China is trying to seize the Mombasa port as a collateral. And so they've been looking very in depth into this case and really explain the very technical terms of the long contract. What are the immunity clauses? What are escrow accounts? How are they being used in this long contract? Just to really clarify a lot of issues that have been really misunderstood by the public. So please, keep an eye for that paper. Yes.
Yeah. To what extent is the data that underlies each of your maps, is that going to be available for other scholars to sort of use it or analyze it or whatever? Are the data sets open? If somebody knows how to, pull data and reorganize it and run different kinds of analyses on it, would that be possible from your maps?
We plan to, this is an open source, like we really hope that will be a tool for people interested in better understanding BRI. And I think they just have to request the data, and we will provide. Yeah, I think that's the idea. Open access source. Yeah.
And for us, we've just published all these profiles with the sources and references. They are all there for people to see.
Right. One of you just mentioned the Kenya Railroad, and that reminds me that I did want to ask, Adele, you had an article, I think it was late last year, where you were comparing the BRI experience in Kenya with Ethiopia. And I think you had an op-ed in the Washington Post about this, and you may have had something published at greater length somewhere else, I'm not sure. But you were making some observations about the differences in the way BRI outcomes looked in the two places, based in part on how local rules were or were not enforced, the degree of activity of local society and monitoring. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because I thought it was a really interesting view of the role that can be played, how local host countries have agency in some of these projects.
So I feel like also from our presentation today, there is so much agencies plural, shaping the BRI that again is not top down. And even with Chinese economic actors abroad, we can see how sometimes they lack sometimes awareness of the central government directives and policy and guidelines that they write about corporate social responsibility. And also what I've noticed on the ground based on the fieldwork that I did in 2019 was that there was a lot of adaptability. So there was this adaptive governance in a way of these Chinese economic actors to the local context. And so if there's like very high regulations, sophisticated regulations, and the government or a very active civil society, then the Chinese economic actors react more promptly to respect high standards or issue corporate social responsibility reports. So there is this the role, a very important role that host countries can play in really shaping the BRI. And that's why I also thought that, for instance, when I was in Africa, why you don't talk to each other and like create more of a shared rules or policy, share experience between different African countries dealing with China, and strategize more and cooperate more together in developing a BRI that benefits you, right? And China, I think, as also Hong was saying before, it's interested in learning. I think there is an awareness of mistakes made in the past, and there is also a desire kind of to improve its records internationally. Also because it harms its international reputation. So there is, and yeah, but what I found that was this sort of adaptability to the host countries, and so that the host country play definitely an important role in shaping BRI, as provinces do.
As provinces do, as many different actors. Well, anything this large would be extremely hard for any government to really control and to micromanage. To just pause a minute on the companies. We only have a few minutes left, but we haven't talked very much about what the Chinese companies are actually doing on the ground. And I'm curious whether in your research, either of you has reached any kind of a conclusion about the extent to which the Chinese companies are typical of multinational corporations in their behavior, or whether they behave uniquely because they are Chinese. In other words, is their behavior, their responsiveness, non-responsiveness, how they treat staff or otherwise interact in the environment, is it fairly typical of what other multinationals in the same environment are doing, or do they stand out in some way because they are Chinese?
Yeah, because part of my research has been about Chinese construction companies going overseas. Of course, we observe many quite distinguishing features about their way of doing business because they operate in the construction sector, infrastructure sector. And a big controversy has been, bringing Chinese workers from China. And I want to say that, of course, that issue sometimes have been overblown. It's not as bad as many people believe. And also over the years, the companies have been trying to localize, trying to hire local employees. And that's also been the policy from the central government. The central government push the companies, because most of these companies are state-owned companies. They push them to be able to localize. But this is still a very hard process for many of the companies because they compete for contracts based on a low cost advantage. A big part of a low cost has to do with being able to bring in Chinese workers. It's not just because Chinese workers have lower wage. In some cases, when they bring in Chinese workers, they pay higher wage to these workers compared to local workers, which is, again, another issue of contention. But it's just from the point of view of the managers, they just feel it's easier to manage Chinese workers. They are more used to the same way of working. They understand the commands and the procedures. And in that way, they feel they still very much rely on Chinese workers in many parts of the projects. And so the localization is much easier said than done. And also because, China's the history of Chinese companies going overseas, it's only a few decades. And a lot of them really don't have the capacity, the cultural language capacity to really be integrated into local environment. So that's again, another another problem. But in terms of, these, but still I think overall, I would still say that the companies are not that different from multinational companies from elsewhere. They go into the markets, they try to identify strategic opportunities for them to operate, they compete, they over-compete sometimes, and they just try to establish a foothold in the market, or through whatever means that's available to them. And that sometimes might include, bringing, because these are state-owned companies, they have very close relations with the government. They might be engaging with the Chinese diplomats more when it comes to troubleshooting, trying to solve certain issues. So that these kind of things do happen. But other than that, they are just companies.
But when I was in Africa, I agree with what Hong was saying. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of private companies as well. There's big state-owned enterprises, but a huge amount of private companies. And I also remember when I did my fieldwork that it's true that they operate similarly, but you don't see American workers building streets in Africa, or Europeans. So I think that's a big difference also of this state, these companies, like what they bring in, what they can do, that in a way it's unique of China in this particular historical time. In the future, it might be not, but like I didn't see any American laying paving the roads in Africa.
I think there might be Indian and Turkish companies quite active in Africa, but not European and American.
No, exactly.
So unfortunately, we have to call time now because our 90 minutes have gone by amazingly quickly. I just want to thank you both so much for this fascinating discussion. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground. I'm feeling a little breathless at how much we galloped through, but I think you managed to both puncture a couple of myths as we went, and also very much expand, certainly speaking personally, expanded my conception. How should I be thinking about BRI, how I need to update the way I think about BRI. It has evolved and become a grand narrative that is in some ways more ambitious and more intriguing than what I had previously thought. So thank you so much for that. And thanks also to the audience for all the fabulous questions. See you all, I hope, in a week for our next program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.